Now, there's something unusual about the continuing pandemic panic. Medical experts now acknowledge that lockdowns don't work. They see that treatment with hydroxychloroquine and zinc does work. And the government responses globally have led to a massive destruction of wealth, well-being and work. Now, none of that makes any sense until you open your mind to consider if there's another agenda at work here. It's one we've seen before, but now it has a new name. It's called the Great Reset. Here's Klaus Schwab, the founder and chairman of the World Economic Forum.
The COVID-19 crisis has shown us that our old systems are not fit anymore for the 21st century. It has laid bare the fundamental lack of social cohesion, fairness, inclusion, and equality. Now is the historical moment, the time, not only to fight the virus, but to shape the system for the need for the post-corona era. But we have another choice. We can build a new social contract. In short, we need a great reset. We have to mobilize all constituents of our global society to work together. We must not miss this unique window of opportunity.
He admits that COVID-19 is the new excuse to usher in the Green New Deal that climate alarmists, climate profiteers and big government advocates have been pushing for years. The Great Reset is a Trojan horse for the socialist agenda of crony capitalism and control. Incredibly, this agenda has been around for a long time, but it's just been hiding in plain sight. In 2010, Dr. Ottmar Edenhofer, then co-chair of the IPCC working group, said, "We, the UN IPCC, redistribute the world's wealth by climate policy. One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has nothing to do with environmental policy anymore." Well, after decades of failing to convince the rational world that their grab for power is necessary, these globalists have now hitched their ambition to COVID-19. Just think about it. The global response to COVID-19 has been a green socialist's dream. Consider their policy agenda and compare it with what's going on. Reduce fossil fuel use? Check. Next to no international travel? Check. Welfare for all? Check. Civil liberties curtailed? Check. Government by bureaucrats? Check. Why do you think the Australian Greens have been so quiet these past months? Well, it's because their policy agenda is coming to life. And it's not only in Australia that it's going on. Canada's farcical PM has emerged from his bunker of racial shame to push the green propaganda button. His newly appointed economic czar recently stated this.
I think all Canadians understand that the restart of our economy needs to be green. It also needs to be equitable. It needs to be inclusive.
It's the same in the USA, where Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are pushing extreme green policies and using Corona to justify another $2 trillion on climate change schemes to, and I quote, create economic opportunity in the wake of coronavirus.
I know that climate change is a challenge that's going to define our American future. I know meeting the challenge will be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to jolt new life into our economy, strengthen our global leadership, protect our planet for future generations. And if I have the honor of being elected president, we're not just going to tinker around the edges. We're going to make historic investments that will seize the opportunity and meet this moment in history.
Well, after decades of peddling climate change lies and propaganda to force government by the elites, the socialists have used a media-induced hysteria over public health as their latest weapon of economic destruction. Now, you may recall the original alarm was triggered by modelling done by Imperial College London, which predicted millions of deaths in the United States alone. So far, there have been around 15,000 mortalities from coronavirus where people did not have other serious underlying health issues. Now, it's no coincidence that this same bunch of pandemic modellers who got it so wrong are also up to their necks in questionable climate change models. One of their professors, Mr. Jim Skier, even co-chaired the IPCC working group in 2017. Make no mistake, the real agenda behind the destruction of the global economy has nothing to do with your health, just like climate change policy has nothing to do with the environment or changing the weather. It's about control, and it's about power, and it's been orchestrated by the same mob who said we'd all be fried by 2015 unless we did exactly what they're trying to do now. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Liberal MP Craig Kelly. Thanks for your time, Craig.
Yeah, good to be with you tonight, Corey.
Look, I've followed this climate change alarmism, and I know you have. You've countered the emotional arguments with facts. You've exposed the propaganda and the agenda behind it. Do you see parallels with this COVID-19 pandemic alarmism and the decades-long climate change hysteria that we've been subjected to?
Corey, there's extraordinary parallels. We've seen with climate change, of course, all these great computer models. Tim Flannery, of course, with his computer models, told us that even the rains that fall would never fill our dams. He told us that Warragamba Dam would never fill. That's what his computer models told him. We've heard all these predictions of the sea ice disappearing in the Arctic and Antarctic. But there's prediction after prediction after prediction has failed to come true. And we've seen exactly the same thing with the modelling for the COVID. All the modelling that we saw, apocalyptic number of deaths, our hospitals unable to cope, so on and so on, Corey. This was all done to scare people, to scare the daylights out of people. And what's been found, Corey, once you see people get scared, often they simply become oblivious to the facts. And that's what I've seen. So many people that young people especially, that I speak to about climate change, have just been scared witless. They've been brainwashed and they're impervious to the facts. Now, we see the same thing with COVID down in Victoria. You see the scare campaign run, and now you've got down there in Victoria, you've got Daniel Andrews just completely ignoring over 600 medical doctors that are saying what you are doing is a disastrous policy that is actually causing more harm than it isn't giving any benefit.
But Craig, our political leaders have effectively outsourced responsibility for these decisions to international bodies, the United Nations, the World Health Organizations, the World Economic Forum, as the basis of the models that they're following. And we know that these models are flawed. The Imperial College in London predicted 40 million deaths from coronavirus, including hundreds of thousands here in Australia. They've always been wrong, and yet it's acting like a protection mechanism, I guess, for our political leaders. Do we need more courage, more authenticity and more self-determination from our political leaders?
Well, that's another great parallel between COVID and also climate change. Anyone that has sort of put their hand up, any medical doctor, and says, hang on a minute, I think the progress is wrong. I think maybe some of these lockdown policies aren't correct. They've been vilified by all the left-wing media, vilified and attacked and have their reputations slandered. Exactly the same thing we've seen in climate change. A lot of very brave, learned professors, climate scientists have come out and said, hey, look, these climate models are simply wrong. This is simply false. I have a different opinion. And the same things happened. They've been vilified, they've been attacked, and they've had their reputations dragged through the mud.
Hey, Craig, we've had this COVID pandemic has seen perhaps a collapse of 30% or so of global GDP.
Yes, yeah.
Now, the International Energy Agency puts the reductions in emissions thanks to this period at around 8%. Now, Bill Gates himself has estimated that each tonne of carbon dioxide has cost between $3,200 and $5,400 in abatement costs. What happens, and why has the government signed up to a 30, 50 or even 100% reduction in emissions when we see the catastrophe that's befallen us for only an 8% reduction?
Yeah, firstly, Corey, remember that put that $3,000, $5,000 per tonne into perspective. Julia Gillard's carbon tax that was going to be so detrimental to Australia was $30 a tonne, not $3,000 or $5,000 a tonne. That's what it's cost. And the other really interesting thing is when you look at what effect it has actually had in the natural environment. Because remember, man-made CO2 emissions are only 3%. Most of the CO2 emissions that we think are terrible come from natural sources, something like 97%. And what's interesting, if you actually look at how CO2 is measured in the atmosphere, which is measured in Hawaii, in the last 12 months, from September 2019 to September 2020, there's been roughly a 3 parts per million increase in CO2 levels. And that was exactly the same increase from September 2018 to 2019. And it's a bigger increase than what we had from 2017 to 2018. So we've gone through all this pain. Sorry, go.
So even when we cut our emissions, they go up anyway.
That's happened. We've cut, remember, you've got man-made emissions and you've got natural emissions. The man-made emissions are only 3% of the total CO2 emissions that are emitted into the atmosphere every year. Now, we've gone through all this suffering. You've had a almost complete close down of the international airlines. You've had big reductions in transport, big reductions in electricity generation, which have had factories closed. And even with that, Corey, you can't even measure it on the scale of how it actually results in the atmosphere. As I said, the last 12 months, the CO2 emissions increase has been exactly the same as the last 12 months. Not one iota of difference, and yet we've had all this pain that we've gone through.
Craig Kelly, keep speaking truth to power. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Corey. Great to be with you.